The bank called me before my wife did, and that was the moment I realized the biggest threat to my future was not the money. It was the person making the decision without me. I still remember exactly where I was standing when I heard those words from the person on the phone. I was in my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee, looking out at the backyard we had spent years improving together. It was an ordinary morning. The kind of morning where you expect nothing unusual to happen. But one phone call changed the way I looked at everything. My name is Michael Bennett, and for 17 years, I believed I understood my marriage better than anyone else. I believed my wife, Lauren, and I were a team. We had built our life slowly, one decision at a time. We bought our first home, planned for retirement, saved for unexpected situations, and created the kind of stability we both wanted. I never thought I would be sitting at my kitchen table wondering if the person beside me was making plans that no longer included me. The call itself was simple. The bank representative asked if I was aware of a large transaction request connected to our joint account. At first, I assumed there was some kind of mistake. Maybe a misunderstanding. Maybe a routine issue that needed clarification. I thanked the representative, ended the call, and immediately opened my banking information. That was when I saw it. A request involving the savings account we had spent years building together. The account we talked about using for our future. The account that represented vacations we planned, emergencies we prepared for, and the security we wanted after decades of hard work. But what caught my attention was not just the amount. It was the fact that Lauren had not said anything to me. After 17 years of marriage, you notice changes. You notice when conversations become different. You notice when someone who used to share everything begins keeping certain things private. Looking at that notification, I did not feel anger first. I felt confusion. I started thinking about all the small moments I had noticed but never questioned. The conversations about needing more independence. The questions about financial access. The comments about making sure she would always be protected. At the time, I thought Lauren was simply being responsible. Everyone wants to feel secure. Everyone wants to know they will be okay if life becomes unpredictable. I never believed that wanting security was wrong. But this felt different. This felt like a decision had been made without the person who had been building that future alongside her. I did not call Lauren immediately. I did not send an emotional message. I did not accuse her of anything before I understood the situation. My years working with financial planning taught me one important lesson. When something does not make sense, you do not react first. You gather information. You understand the facts. You make careful decisions. So I sat down at the kitchen table and started reviewing everything. The account history. The recent activity. The details I had never thought I needed to question. And as I looked closer, I began realizing something that was harder to accept than any financial problem. The real issue was never the money. The money was only the first sign. The real issue was trust. Because when someone you love starts making important decisions without you, the hardest thing to protect is not a bank account. It is the belief that you are still standing on the same side. And that morning, for the first time in 17 years, I started wondering if Lauren and I were still looking toward the same future. For years, I believed the strongest part of my marriage was the history Lauren and I had built together. When you spend nearly 2 decades with someone, you do not just share a house or a bank account. You share memories, decisions, sacrifices, and countless moments that shape who you become. That was why the situation was so difficult to understand. I was not looking at a stranger making a financial decision. I was looking at my wife, the person I had trusted for 17 years. After the call from the bank, I spent the rest of that day trying to understand what had changed. I did not want to assume the worst about Lauren. I knew there had to be a reason behind her actions. People do not usually make major decisions without believing they have a reason. The question was whether that reason included me or existed separately from me. As I reviewed everything, I started thinking about the months leading up to that morning. There were small moments that seemed ordinary at the time. Looking back, they felt different. Lauren had started asking more questions about our finances. She wanted to understand how different accounts worked, how quickly money could be accessed, and what options were available if someone needed to make changes. I actually appreciated her interest at first. Financial planning had always been something I cared about, and I thought it was a positive sign that she wanted to become more involved. But eventually, the conversations began changing. They were less about what we could build together and more about what she would need if things changed. One evening, we were sitting in the living room after dinner when Lauren brought up the idea of being prepared for unexpected situations. She looked at me and said, "I think everyone needs to know they can stand on their own." I understood the statement. Independence is important. Everyone wants to feel secure. But I noticed something about the way she said it. It did not sound like a conversation about our future. It sounded like preparation for a future where she had to rely only on herself. I asked her if something was wrong between us. She paused for a moment and then said, "You always think something is wrong." That answer stayed with me because it avoided the question. Instead of explaining what she was feeling, it made me question whether I was even allowed to ask. I wanted to believe I was overthinking everything. I wanted to believe this was simply a stressful period in our lives. Every marriage goes through difficult seasons. Every person changes over time. But there is a difference between accepting change and ignoring warning signs. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Lauren becoming more careful about certain conversations. She started handling some information privately. She spent more time researching financial topics on her own. None of those things alone proved anything. A person can want privacy without having bad intentions. But together, those moments created a pattern I could no longer ignore. That was the hardest part to accept. Not that Lauren wanted security. Not that she wanted options. The hardest part was realizing she had started creating that security without involving me. That night, after Lauren went to bed, I sat in my office and looked through our financial records again. I looked at the years we had spent building our life. I looked at the plans we had made. And I finally understood something important. The account issue was only the beginning. The real story was about trust. Because when someone starts preparing for a future without you, the first thing you lose is not money. It is the feeling that you are still a team. And that was the feeling I needed to understand before I decided what to do next. The more I reviewed what had happened, the more I realized that the hardest part was not discovering information. It was accepting what that information meant about my marriage. When you love someone for 17 years, your mind naturally tries to protect the relationship before it accepts that something may be wrong. You remember the good moments first. You remember the first house you bought together. You remember the conversations about the future. You remember the nights when you both sat at the kitchen table discussing goals, savings, and the life you wanted to create. Those memories make it difficult to admit that the person sitting beside you may no longer be making decisions with the same vision. But I knew I needed to understand the full picture. I did not want to react based on assumptions. I wanted facts. So I started paying closer attention to the details I had previously overlooked. I began reviewing our financial history more carefully. I looked at patterns instead of individual moments. I wanted to understand whether this was simply a misunderstanding or something Lauren had been preparing for over time. That was when I started noticing how often she brought up the idea of protecting herself. The phrase sounded harmless. In many ways, it was reasonable. Everyone should think about their future. Everyone should have a sense of security. But the more I heard it, the more I wondered why the conversation always seemed to focus on her protection instead of our protection. One evening, I came home from work earlier than usual. When I walked into the kitchen, I saw Lauren sitting at the counter with her laptop open. She quickly closed a page when she noticed me entering the room. It was a small movement. Something that most people would probably ignore. But after everything I had noticed recently, it stood out. "Everything okay?" I asked. She looked at me and smiled. "Of course. I was just looking at some things." I nodded and did not push further. That moment taught me something important. Sometimes asking more questions does not reveal the truth immediately. Sometimes people reveal more when they believe they still have control over the situation. Over the next several days, I continued observing without making accusations. I noticed Lauren was spending more time researching financial information. She was asking fewer questions about our shared plans and more questions about individual options. Again, none of those actions alone meant something terrible. A person can have concerns. A person can want independence. But when enough small details appear together, they create a picture that becomes impossible to ignore. One night, while we were sitting in the living room, Lauren brought up the subject again. "I just think everyone needs to be prepared," she said. I looked at her and asked, "Prepared for what?" She paused before answering. "For anything." Those two words stayed with me. For anything. It was a simple phrase, but it carried a meaning I could not ignore. It sounded like she was preparing for possibilities that did not include me standing beside her. I did not argue. I did not try to force an explanation. I simply listened. Because at that point, I understood something important. The biggest problem was not that Lauren wanted security. The biggest problem was that she had stopped believing security could exist within our partnership. That realization was painful, but it also gave me clarity. I returned to my office that night and opened my computer. I began organizing the information I had gathered, not because I wanted conflict, but because I needed to make responsible decisions. For the first time in months, I stopped hoping the situation would fix itself. I accepted that I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. After weeks of watching, listening, and trying to understand what was happening, I reached a point where I knew I could not simply wait anymore. Waiting had always been my natural response. Throughout our marriage, I was the person who believed most problems could be solved through patience and communication. I believed that if two people cared enough, they could find their way back to each other. But this situation felt different because the problem was not a disagreement. The problem was that important decisions were being made without my knowledge. I needed to stop hoping for clarity and start creating it. The first thing I did was focus on facts. I reviewed our financial information carefully and made sure I understood every detail. I looked at our joint accounts, our savings history, and the decisions we had made over the years. I was not searching for a reason to blame Lauren. I was trying to understand the situation completely before taking any action. That was something I had learned through my work in financial planning. Emotions can make situations feel larger than they are. Facts help you see what is actually happening. Once I had a clearer picture, I decided to speak with a professional who could help me understand my options. I explained everything honestly. I talked about the unusual activity, the conversations Lauren and I had been having, and my concerns about protecting our shared responsibilities. I did not exaggerate. I did not describe Lauren as a bad person. I simply explained what had happened. The advice I received was straightforward. Stay calm. Document everything. Follow the proper process. Make decisions based on information, not fear. Those words helped me more than I expected. For the first time since the bank called me, I felt like I was no longer reacting to a situation I did not understand. I was taking responsible steps based on what I knew. I began organizing important records and making sure everything connected to our finances was clear. It was not dramatic. There was no confrontation. No accusations. Just preparation. That was difficult for me because part of me still wanted Lauren to come to me and explain everything. I wanted her to say there was a misunderstanding. I wanted to believe that the person I had shared 17 years with would never intentionally leave me out of something so important. But I also knew that hoping for the best did not mean ignoring reality. One evening, Lauren noticed that I was spending more time in my office. She stood near the doorway and asked, "Are you working on something important?" I looked at her and answered honestly. "I am making sure everything is organized." She studied my expression for a moment. "Organized for what?" she asked. I paused before answering. "For whatever comes next." The room became quiet. I could see that my answer affected her. Maybe because she expected me to be confused. Maybe because she expected me to continue pretending everything was normal. But I was no longer pretending. I still cared about Lauren. I still respected the years we shared. But I also understood that protecting myself was not an act of betrayal. It was a responsibility. That night, I looked around our home and thought about everything we had built together. The memories were real. The good years were real. But so was the uncertainty we were facing. And I knew the next decision I made would determine whether I stayed vulnerable or became prepared for whatever Lauren chose to do next. The hardest part about preparing for uncertainty was accepting that preparation itself felt like a change in our marriage. For years, Lauren and I had operated with the belief that we were always on the same side. Every major decision had been a conversation. Every important goal had been something we discussed together. That was why taking steps without telling her felt uncomfortable. It was not because I wanted to hide anything. It was because I needed time to understand what was happening before another decision was made without me. I continued moving carefully. I reviewed the information I had gathered and made sure everything was organized. I checked the details of our financial arrangements and made sure I understood what actions were possible and what steps needed to be followed. I was not trying to control the situation. I was trying to prevent a situation where emotions could create even more damage. One thing I kept reminding myself was that this was not a competition between Lauren and me. It was not about proving who was right. It was about protecting the stability we had both worked toward for years. That mindset helped me stay calm. A few days later, I noticed Lauren seemed more confident than before. She acted like everything was moving according to her expectations. She continued with her normal routine, and from the outside, nothing seemed different. But I could tell she believed she was the only person making plans. She did not realize that I had started paying attention. She did not realize that I had started preparing. That evening, we had dinner together at the same table where we had shared thousands of conversations over the years. I looked at the person sitting across from me and remembered all the reasons I had trusted her. That was the part that made everything complicated. When someone disappoints you, it is easy to focus only on the negative moments. But real relationships are built from years of memories, and those memories do not disappear because of one difficult situation. After dinner, Lauren mentioned that she had been thinking a lot about the future. I listened carefully. "I think people need to make sure they are okay no matter what happens," she said. I looked at her and asked, "Do you feel like we are not okay?" She paused. "That is not what I mean." But there was hesitation in her answer. It was the same hesitation I had noticed before. The feeling that there were thoughts she was keeping to herself. I did not push her for answers that night. Instead, I focused on staying calm. I had already learned that forcing someone to explain something before they were ready rarely created honesty. Sometimes the truth appears when people realize they cannot avoid it forever. The next morning, I completed the final steps of my preparation. Everything was handled through the appropriate channels. Everything was documented. Everything was done carefully and responsibly. I did not feel like I had won anything. I did not feel proud that I had to take these steps. In fact, I wished I never needed to take them at all. But I also felt a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I knew I was ready. Later that afternoon, Lauren asked me a question that confirmed she noticed something had changed. "Have you been doing something with our accounts?" she asked. I looked at her and realized this was the moment when the situation was no longer happening only in my mind. The person who had been planning quietly was finally realizing that I had been paying attention too. I answered calmly. "I have been making sure everything is protected and properly handled." She became quiet. And in that silence, I knew Lauren was beginning to understand something important. The husband she thought was unaware had never stopped listening. He had simply been waiting until he understood the truth. The question from Lauren changed the atmosphere between us. It was not because she sounded angry or upset. It was because, for the first time, she realized that I was no longer simply accepting everything without understanding it. I could see the surprise on her face when she asked about the accounts. She expected an explanation. She expected me to tell her that nothing had changed. But the truth was that something had changed. I had changed. Not because I wanted conflict, but because I finally understood that protecting a relationship does not mean ignoring the signs that something is wrong. I looked at Lauren and answered calmly. I wanted to make sure everything was handled responsibly. She stayed quiet for a moment. "Why did you feel like you had to do that?" she asked. It was a fair question, and I knew the answer would determine what happened next. I could have responded with frustration. I could have listed every moment that made me question what was happening. But I did not want the conversation to become about blame. I wanted it to be about understanding. Because I felt like decisions about our future were being made without me, I said. Those words changed the conversation. Lauren looked away for a moment. I could tell she was thinking about everything that had happened. The small conversations. The questions about finances. The things she had done without explaining them. For the first time, I think she understood that the issue was not simply about money. It was about trust. Over the next few days, we had several conversations about what had happened. They were not easy conversations, but they were necessary. Lauren explained that she had been thinking about her own security and what would happen if life changed unexpectedly. She told me she never intended to create a situation where I felt excluded. She believed she was simply being prepared. I listened because I wanted to understand her perspective. I did not want to assume I knew everything she was feeling. But I also explained my side. I told her that preparation is different when it is done together. A marriage is built on communication, especially when decisions affect both people. The hardest part was realizing that we had both been thinking about security in completely different ways. Lauren was thinking about protecting herself. I was thinking about protecting what we had built together. Neither of us wanted uncertainty, but we were responding to it differently. That realization did not immediately fix everything. Trust does not return because two people have one honest conversation. It takes time. It takes consistency. It takes both people being willing to acknowledge what happened and why it hurt. One evening, after another long conversation, I sat alone in my office and looked back at the past few months. I thought about how easily small changes can become bigger problems when people stop communicating. I thought about how close we came to making decisions based on assumptions instead of honesty. The financial situation had forced us to look at something deeper. We had to look at the foundation of our marriage. The next morning, I received confirmation that everything had been properly reviewed and organized. There was no dramatic moment. No celebration. Just a quiet sense of responsibility. I knew I had done what I needed to do. I had protected myself without losing respect for Lauren. And that mattered to me. Because the person I wanted to be was not someone who reacted with anger when trust was tested. I wanted to be someone who could face a difficult moment, make thoughtful decisions, and still recognize the humanity of the person on the other side. But I also knew that the hardest conversation was not behind us yet. We still needed to understand how two people who spent 17 years building a life together reached a point where they were preparing for different futures. The conversations Lauren and I had after that moment were some of the most difficult conversations we had experienced in 17 years of marriage. Not because we were angry with each other, but because we were finally discussing the things we had both avoided for too long. Sometimes the hardest truths are not the ones people hide. They are the ones people never say out loud. For a long time, Lauren and I had both believed we were protecting our future. The difference was that we had chosen completely different ways to do it. Lauren believed she needed to create security for herself. I believed security came from working together and making decisions as a team. That difference was where the distance between us began. One evening, we sat at the dining table after dinner, the same place where we had planned vacations, discussed home improvements, and talked about our goals over the years. The familiar surroundings made the conversation even more emotional because every corner of that room represented a memory we shared. Lauren looked at me and said, "I never wanted you to feel like I was against you." I believed she meant it. That was the complicated part. I did not think Lauren was trying to destroy everything we had built. I thought she was afraid. But fear can sometimes make people make choices that hurt the people closest to them. I told her that I understood wanting to feel secure. I understood wanting to know that you could handle unexpected changes in life. But I also explained that there was a difference between preparing for challenges and quietly making decisions that affect both people. That difference mattered. During our conversation, Lauren admitted that she had been worried about the future for a long time. She felt like she needed more control over certain parts of her life. She explained that she was not trying to exclude me. She believed she was simply protecting herself. Hearing that helped me understand her perspective, but it did not erase how I felt. I told her that the biggest problem was never the account. The account was just where the problem became visible. The real issue was that we had reached a point where one person was making important plans while the other person was still believing they were building the same future together. That was the part that hurt the most. We talked for hours that night. We talked about mistakes we had both made. We talked about moments when communication could have been better. We talked about how easy it is for two people to become disconnected even while living in the same home. I realized something important during that conversation. A marriage does not fall apart because of one difficult moment. It happens when small problems remain unspoken for too long. The financial situation forced us to finally discuss everything we had been avoiding. It forced us to look beyond the numbers and focus on the relationship itself. In the days that followed, I noticed a difference in Lauren. She was no longer focused only on protecting her own position. She started asking questions about how we could communicate better. She started listening instead of preparing her next response. That did not mean everything was suddenly fixed. Trust takes time to rebuild. But it was the first sign that we were finally moving from defending our own positions toward understanding each other. Looking back, I realized that the most important moment was not when I discovered the financial issue. It was when we finally stopped talking about money and started talking about why we had stopped trusting each other. Because sometimes the biggest problems in a relationship are not created by what people do. They are created by what people stop sharing. In the weeks that followed our conversations, I started noticing something I had not expected. The biggest change was not in our finances. It was in the way Lauren and I communicated. For months, we had been having separate conversations in our own minds. Lauren was thinking about her security. I was thinking about protecting the future we had built together. We were both trying to solve a problem, but we were solving different problems because we had stopped truly listening to each other. That realization changed the way I looked at everything. For a long time, I thought the financial situation was the main issue. I thought the account, the decisions, and the planning were the things we needed to fix. But after all our conversations, I understood something deeper. The account was only a symbol. The real issue was trust. Trust is built through thousands of small actions. It is built when two people communicate honestly, even when the conversation is uncomfortable. It is built when both people believe they are working toward the same goal. And when that belief starts to disappear, even small decisions can feel much bigger than they appear. Lauren and I began having more honest conversations about our expectations. We talked about what security meant to each of us. We talked about the fears we had not shared. We talked about the moments when we both felt alone, even while we were living under the same roof. Some of those conversations were difficult because honesty requires admitting things that are not easy to hear. I had to accept that I was not always as open as I believed I was. I had spent years focusing on providing stability, but sometimes I forgot that emotional communication was just as important. Lauren had to accept that making major decisions without involving me created a distance that damaged the trust between us. Neither of us walked away from those conversations feeling completely comfortable. But we both walked away understanding each other better. That mattered. One evening, I was sitting in the same kitchen where I first received the bank call. I looked around and thought about how much had changed since that morning. The walls were the same. The furniture was the same. The memories were still there. But I was different. I no longer looked at the situation as something that happened to me. I looked at it as a lesson about relationships, communication, and self-respect. I realized that protecting myself did not mean I had stopped caring about Lauren. It meant I had learned that a healthy relationship requires both people to be responsible for the trust they share. Around that time, we also started making clearer agreements about how we would handle important decisions in the future. We discussed finances more openly. We created better habits for communication. We stopped assuming the other person automatically understood what we were thinking. It was a simple change, but it made a significant difference. I do not believe difficult moments disappear just because people talk about them once. Real change requires consistency. It requires both people showing through their actions that they are willing to rebuild what was damaged. Looking back, I realized the most valuable thing I gained from that experience was not control over a financial situation. It was clarity. I learned that love is not just about trusting someone when everything is easy. Love is also about being honest when things become complicated. The future is never guaranteed, but the way we choose to handle uncertainty says a lot about who we are. And after everything that happened, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer afraid of difficult conversations. Because sometimes the conversation you avoid is the one that can finally bring the truth into the open. Looking back now, I realize the moment that changed my life was not the day I received the call from the bank. It was not the day I discovered that Lauren had been making plans without me. The real turning point came later, when I understood what that experience was trying to teach me. For a long time, I believed protecting my family meant making sure everything around me was stable. I believed that if I worked hard, planned carefully, and stayed committed, I could prevent difficult moments from happening. But life does not work that way. No amount of preparation can guarantee that people will always make the choices you expect. What you can control is how you respond when those moments arrive. After everything that happened, Lauren and I had to make decisions about our future. We had to be honest about where we were and whether we could rebuild the trust that had been damaged. Those decisions were not simple. 17 years together cannot be reduced to one difficult chapter. There were still years of memories, kindness, and moments that mattered. The life we built was real, even though we reached a point where we had to question what came next. What changed the most was the way I viewed trust. Before everything happened, I thought trust meant believing someone would never disappoint you. I thought it meant assuming that the person beside you would always see things the same way you did. But I learned that real trust is not about ignoring problems. Real trust requires honesty, communication, and the willingness to face uncomfortable conversations before they become bigger issues. I also learned something about myself. I was so focused on being dependable that I sometimes forgot I was also allowed to have boundaries. I wanted to be the person who solved problems, supported others, and kept everything moving forward. But being responsible for others does not mean abandoning responsibility for yourself. That lesson changed the way I approached every part of my life. Months later, I found myself sitting in the same kitchen where everything started. The same table was there. The same windows looked out toward the backyard. The same morning light came through the room. But the person sitting there was different. I was no longer looking at the past with confusion. I was looking at it with understanding. I did not see the experience as a failure. I saw it as a reminder that every relationship requires attention. Every partnership requires two people choosing each other through actions, not just words. Lauren and I both learned from what happened. We learned that avoiding difficult conversations does not protect a relationship. It only creates more distance. We learned that financial decisions are rarely just about money. They are often about security, trust, and the way people feel valued. Most importantly, we learned that honesty has to come before comfort. Today, when I think about that difficult period, I do not focus on what I almost lost. I focus on what I gained. I gained a better understanding of myself. I gained the courage to face uncertainty without fear. I gained the knowledge that protecting my future does not mean closing my heart. It means respecting myself enough to make thoughtful choices. The biggest lesson I carry with me is simple. The strongest relationships are not the ones that never face challenges. They are the ones where people are willing to face the truth, learn from it, and decide what kind of future they want to create. And sometimes, the moment that feels like the end of everything becomes the moment when you finally understand what truly matters.